Okay, so there are a lot of common questions that I get from people as it relates to their mineral rights or royalty interests. Today we're going to cover one of those most frequently asked questions, and I'm super excited because we have one of our listeners who will be featured on the show today as a special guest. Today we're going to talk about how mineral rights are valued and what are your options. So let's cue the music.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
All right, so we have a special guest today joining us. We have Justin, who's on the line, and just want to say hello to Justin Williams, who's a fellow mineral owner and listener of the podcast, and he reached out, and he's going to be featured as a special guest in several upcoming episodes. So first of all, thank you, Justin, for your time today, and why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, my background as a mineral right owner was kind of by surprise. We found out we inherited some minerals from, I guess, a great uncle who was in the West Texas oil fields, and it's been a battle of just discovering what it is that we should do, how to deed these things to ourselves. What does it mean? What is it worth? Should we accept what documents that are sent to us? And it's been a huge learning curve, which I'm sure that you learn from people every day that you speak to. So I look forward to helping people out and trying to bring the information to them because I know my head has been swirling for the last 3 months.
Yeah, and I know where you're coming from. I know when I first got into the business and transitioning from different roles in the oil and gas industry, I knew enough to be dangerous, and there's certainly I've learned a lot over the several years, but it can be very, very confusing. I know that this today we're going to talk a little bit. I know one of the questions you had posed to me was, how do I value my minerals? And I think that's a common question I've heard from other listeners and from people that I've gotten email from. And so I think a lot of other people have that same question. I know that I did before I started getting into it. And so, I think what we can talk about a little bit is how we value mineral rights, different approaches, and then just kind of and go from there and talk about some examples for people to relate to potentially.
Yeah, I think that sounds great, Matt. And I think a lot of mineral right owners aren't aware of the different approaches and where they may apply to them. So speaking about the market approach and income approach, I think those will be very useful for people. And I'll let you as the expert dive into that.
Okay, yeah. Well, thanks. I think the first place to start, when you think about mineral rights, it's a form of real property. So if we were to, take a step back and think about the different types of properties as it comes to minerals and oil and gas, it's, you have actual mineral rights where you own the right to extract the minerals and oil and gas from the ground. And if you have a fee simple ownership, that's where you potentially own the surface rights and the minerals. That's common in many areas. I know at least here in Colorado, where both you and I are from, as the property is transferred over time, unless an owner specifically reserves the minerals, it will transfer the mineral rights along with the surface. So that kind of leads into the next type, which is severed mineral rights. So that's where you might own mineral rights separately from the surface. So somebody else might own the surface rights. And this sometimes happens where, if there's been oil and gas development in an area, maybe an oil and gas company has approached the owner to lease their minerals. They say, oh, wow, there's value to this. I'm going to hold on to this, maybe pass it down to my grandkids. So they will, if they ever move or sell the farm kind of a thing, they'll sell the surface rights and then they'll reserve the mineral rights. And so they keep that. So that's the other key type as it comes to mineral rights. There are other related types that are, one is carved out of the mineral estate as a non-participating royalty interest, or NPRI. I have a blog post on my website, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes, that if you want to learn more about different property types, there's more information there. But just a brief summary there, that's where someone owns the royalty interest that does not have executive rights. You could not sign an oil and gas lease if you own an MPRI. So if you potentially want to sell, we'll talk about what options of, if somebody's approached you to sell, but you want to maintain control, that's a vehicle for doing just that, where you can sell a specific percentage of your of the royalty, and then keep control and be able to, if somebody were to, and say this is unleased minerals, you could still have the ability to get the lease bonus and decide which lease, if you want to lease, or not lease if you don't want to. So that gives you that ability. The other side of things are what comes out of the leasehold interest. And so that's if you sign a lease, there are different interest types. So there's a non-operated working interest, and then there's operated working interest. So you could sign a lease, and what may happen is an operator will lease the minerals from you. They may have, at that point, they'll have operated working interest, potential, if they want to go ahead and drill a well. They may decide to sell a portion of their interest to kind of get some cash to help fund that capital expenditure. And to do that, they may sell a non-operated working interest. So there's somebody that would have the financial liability associated with drilling the well, any maintenance and operating costs, and then plugging and abandoning that well when it's done producing and it's time to reclaim. And so that's another type which we won't really cover today, because most of the focus is on valuation of mineral rights. But those are the different property types.
Absolutely, I think so. And as mineral right owners, I think it's a concept worth noting that you have to really look at what it is that you own, because when you're looking at the deeds, I know personally, not being an oil and gas attorney, sometimes it can be easy to miss what it is that you actually own. And I'm sure you've seen that too, Matt. And it takes time to really look through and understand what it is exactly that you received and what it is that you inherited, because it can be mineral rights, it can be royalties, so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, definitely look at the fine print if you don't understand the language, which is pretty common. They're a lot of times pretty complex and a lot of legalese in there, and it's definitely worth your time and money to hire an attorney to review that and help you understand exactly what you own. And then, we'll talk a little bit about this in future episodes, maybe in more detail. But a lot of times what you may find is that you have title issues. So I know that you've run across that, I think, and sometimes hiring an attorney or a landman can help you turf that up and understand if you need to maybe cure any gaps in the chain of title before you were to consider transferring the minerals. So if you inherit them, if you want to create an LLC or transfer them to your kids or something like that, before you can do that, you need to clear up any title issues. And so that is something that we'll cover in more detail, but that's a pretty common issue in inherited minerals.
Absolutely. All right, Matt. And so I'm a mineral rights owner. I now know what it is that I own, and I'm looking to find out what they are worth. What are my options?
What you need to consider really is, what is the level of activity in your area? So if you are wanting to get an understanding of what your minerals are worth, the thing that you need to really think about first is, are they producing minerals or non-producing? Producing minerals, the definition there is that you're actually getting a royalty check. You have wells that are producing oil or gas that are part of a spacing unit that your minerals are associated with. And so you would be getting a regular royalty check, maybe once a month or every few months if it's small. So that's first thing. Second thing is non-producing, which is kind of what like it sounds. It doesn't have a producing well on it. The thing you can do, if it's an example of non-producing minerals, you can go to your state's oil and gas commission's website, and most of them have an online map that will show well locations, permitted wells where there are pending permits, where there are producing wells. And even if you'd have non-producing minerals, it could be in an area that is an active exploration or active development area. And so the way you can figure that out is going to that Oil and Gas Commission website. I'll post a couple of links in the show notes where you can go. And so that would be probably the first place. You can look at the legal description. A lot of times you can turn on a layer that will show you the land survey system, and you can look at the legal description. So if you know the legal description of your minerals, you can pinpoint where it is on the map and see if there's any activity nearby. That's probably the first step. Once you know that, that'll provide some guidance as to, is there demand for my minerals? And that's just sort of supply and demand when you think about general kind of macro terms. If there's a lot of activity in an area, you could expect that your minerals might demand more, in terms of price per acre, versus if you're in the middle of nowhere, there's no wells that have been drilled in decades, there's no real ongoing or any recent exploration work going on. In that case, you may not expect to potentially get a lot, and maybe it's worth holding on to them if you're getting offers that are potentially what you feel is low, and you have options, right? So the way that you would potentially figure out how to value them, there's really kind of two key methods. The first one I'll talk about is a market approach. It's like if you think about real estate, your home that you may live in, you have Zillow, right? You can go on Zillow, you can look up your house, see what they say the Z estimate is, and see how much it's worth. Fortunately, that does not exist for mineral rights, and so we can't go to the Zillow for mineral rights and just pull up in our legal description. It'll say, oh yeah, your minerals are worth $5,000 an acre based on here's the recent comparable sales, etc. The reason that doesn't exist is because that information is usually not available publicly. Most states, when you have a real estate transaction, they're not required to disclose the sale amount, and so most cases be exempt from that, and not have to disclose how much was paid. And so there's not a lot of publicly available information. There are ways to get that. If you're going to do a market approach, you need really kind of a statistically significant number of transactions, arm's length transactions, where there's not some other compensation that's provided outside of cash for the minerals. Sometimes you can get some of that information from auction websites like EnergyNet. So that's probably the first way to go. And again, it's probably the most valid if you have a lot of data, because it really is an indication of what a willing buyer would be willing to pay for minerals in that area. In that case, it's sort of the market. You can easily determine the fair market value. So does that make sense, Justin? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it would be fair to say that, when you can take the market approach, it would definitely be the preferred way to do so. Because if an area is starting to heat up and the oil and gas companies are competing over that land, you're going to be able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, if there's an area that has a lot of activity, there may be some data out there. And again, if you spend the time, you can gather some of that. Again, the difficulty with auction data, just a caveat there, is that you don't know if somebody got caught up in auction fever and didn't really know what they were doing, what they were bidding on. They may have overpaid, or conversely, maybe they were able to go in there and sneak in and kind of get it for less than the market value. So you got to really take some of that data with a grain of salt. I think having a large number, probably 50 or more transactions in a short period of time, in a 6-month period in a specific area, is important. The other thing to consider is that even though it's in that particular county, there are geologic differences between minerals in one township versus another township. There could be information that geologists have, like 3D seismic data, that they're able to pinpoint the location of a structure in that formation. And if they feel like there may be a higher productivity from a well that's drilled in that area, they may be willing to pay more for minerals in one area versus minerals in another section, even a couple of sections over, just because they know there's a specific structure there. So even with these shale plays that are typically pretty widespread and not relying as much on traps and structures like conventional oil and gas plays, there still is some of that to consider. So some areas may demand a higher value than others. Okay, so that's in a nutshell more the market approach. So looking at comparable sales, and the way you kind of look at that is you want to get down to what's a price per net mineral acre for all of these approaches. So that sort of normalizes the price. If you have 5 acres versus 10 versus 20, you can kind of get a feel for price per net mineral acre, which is the kind of the equivalent of price per square foot when you look at a house. So if you get an offer, that's the thing to focus on and look at, not the total amount per se. I mean, that's important too, but understand the price per net mineral acre, and that'll tell you really what you're getting paid. Or the next approach is the cash flow analysis, or an income approach. And this is also sometimes called an engineering analysis. And the reason for that is you have to do some work to analyze nearby production from what they call typical wells or type wells. And what you do is you look at where the mineral rights are located, and then you were to take a sample of existing wells that are analog to what you expect would be drilled on these minerals. And this is especially important for non-producing minerals, where maybe there aren't existing wells that have been drilled recently that are horizontal wells that you can say, okay, well, this is what a well in that exactly in my property is going to produce. What you have to do is look at the surrounding area, and kind of how wide you go on that is dependent on how much data is available. So if there's a lot of activity nearby, you can look at kind of narrow it down to within a couple of sections potentially from where your minerals are located, and figure out what the typical production is for a horizontal well of a certain length. That's another important piece, is if you may have a 1 mile lateral, so a well that goes down to the target formation and then goes out horizontally for about a mile, a 1 mile lateral, that's sometimes referred to, or a 2 mile lateral. And you can have somebody that's qualified to do this. I'll look at that and say, okay, what's the trend in that area? What are the direction those wells are oriented? How long are they? I'm going to pick analog wells surrounding that, look at what the production is. So they take that group of wells and they'll forecast production based on historical data, and then come up with a curve, a type curve is what it's called. But they look at that type well and they put together a curve, they forecast production, and say, okay, this is what well that if it were drilled in the future, what I'm going to expect the production to look like. So they take that type curve, and then based on the spacing in that area, they'll look at how many wells might be drilled on that property or associated with that property. And they'll forecast out production for all those wells based on when they think they're going to be drilled. So what you end up getting is a cash flow over time that you can analyze and come up with a net present value. So what that is, a net present value is basically the sum of the discounted cash flows in the future as if it were in today's dollars. So if you were to get a check today and then you were to invest that money at a certain interest rate, it would be equivalent in value of your future royalty checks over the entire life of the wells. Okay, so from today's standpoint. So that's how a lot of mineral buyers, if they're not just sending a shotgun approach and sending you a lowball offer in the mail, if they're going to do a true engineering analysis, what they should be doing is saying, okay, your minerals are located here. And they generally, if they're active in the area, they may have this, a database that they've built up, and they know minerals in this area, this is what it's worth to us based on what we can invest money at and what kind of return we can get. And so this is what we'd be willing to pay based on that. And that's that cash flow analysis. And so that's something that could take an experienced person a couple hours to perform. So what they would typically do is look at your minerals, look at the spacing orders in your section, look at any permitted wells, and look at existing wells, and kind of figure out exactly all the details they need to know to do that analysis. And, so if you're going to pay somebody, so if you have a significant mineral estate, so if you have more than just, an acre or so, it's probably worth considering if you're thinking about selling your minerals. This is a pretty common way to get a feel for a fair market value range, is you can have a qualified person perform a valuation of your minerals and say, okay, here's what we think it's worth on a price per net mineral acre basis based on all this data. And, for 2 to 4 hours worth of time, that will end up costing you about $400 to $800 on average. So again, if you get into areas like the Permian where offers are coming in at multiple tens of thousands of dollars, and you have, several net acres, then it's a drop in the bucket compared to the value of that property. And especially if you were to say, wow, I got an offer of $10,000 an acre or $15,000 an acre. I'm rich. I'm going to run to the bank and cash this check. I have 5 acres. That's $50,000. I can invest that money and set up a legacy for my kids. Well, hold on a second. That may actually be worth $20,000 or $30,000. And so if you don't have a good feel for that, you could be leaving, a significant amount of money on the table. So definitely something to consider. So I guess that kind of summarizes the income approach and when you might consider using it.
The only thing I was going to ask that you might add with this is, when you're selling mineral rights, when is it the buyer's job and when is it the seller's job to have these things done? I mean, that's not always a black and white answer, but maybe something you could speak on a little bit, because I know it was a big question I had.
Yeah, I think you're going to get an offer from if somebody wants to buy your minerals, they'll probably send you a letter in the mail, talk to them, and you may go back and forth, and they'll end up sending you an offer letter. Typically, what that will just include, it'll be, we're willing to pay you. Here's the price per net mineral acre. Here's the legal description of your minerals. Sign here if you agree. So it's not going to be on the buyer to necessarily provide you with a comprehensive valuation, so you understand if their offer is fair, right? It would not be necessarily in their best interest. So, even though I in the cases where we buy minerals, we actually do provide some of that. We'll actually give them the lowdown of what we think when a well would be drilled, realistically, and that informs our, the timing of when that production is going to come online, and then subsequently the value. So we actually will provide that kind of information. But at the end of the day, these most mineral buyers are going to give you an offer that they have some wiggle room, and so it's a negotiation. It's a business negotiation. So like if you were, say buying and selling a house. So here's what the comps are. Here's what the price per square foot is. So here's what we think your house is worth based on X, Y, and Z. And maybe you need to do some maintenance, or it needs to be updated, or maybe it's on the top end. These are the kinds of things that you would know going into that transaction. So if you get an offer from somebody, let's say to buy your house, and you say, well, yeah, this seems like a reasonable offer given what our realtor has told us the comparable sales are. So you kind of know the value of it. So I would recommend for people, if they are considering selling, do the work and hire somebody to help you get that. The other thing that'll be done, and it's all in negotiation. So in terms of what a buyer is going to do versus a seller, it all comes down to what you ask for. So I'll kind of maybe talk about the process. I don't know, does that make sense, Justin, to get into that and talk about what are the steps and maybe what are the documents involved and who might pay for what when? Does that help?
Absolutely. I think that would be great. That way to kind of place the information of where these would be applicable for people.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say that you get an offer. One thing to consider, the first thing is the price, right? So per net mineral acre. And so then the next thing is sort of who pays for the due diligence work. And typically the mineral buyer will pay for this. You could potentially demand a higher price per net mineral acre if you have already hired a landman or an attorney to do a title search, and you have a title opinion, which would be awesome from a mineral buyer to look at that, or even just a run sheet and kind of a breakdown of here's the documents that are out there. That'll get them started, give them a head start, and that'll save them money on doing their own title search. So once you go under contract and you've signed a purchase and sale agreement to sell your minerals, the mineral buyer will then go and run a title search on your property to make sure that you own exactly what they think in terms of the net mineral acres, to make sure they're not going to pay you for minerals that you don't own, and or on the flip side, help you make sure that they pay you for what you do own. So that's the first thing. So they'll and that'll usually turf up any title issues. So if there's a gap in the chain of title, say grandpa still is a owner of record of these minerals, even though maybe mom had a trust that she passed those down to, and then you inherited it from that, and it still shows up in the clerk and recorder's office. If you pull the deeds there, it's your grandfather that owns it. So you need to cure that gap between the mom and the trust potentially, and then you, if you're looking at selling them. And those are the things that a mineral buyer needs to know, because in order for you to have marketable title to pass it down to them, some things would need to be fixed. In terms of those curative issues, depending on how severe they are, that is a negotiation. Kind of like when you buy a house, there's the inspection period. So this is kind of like the inspection period for minerals, where somebody will go in and do the due diligence and say, oh yeah, actually, your house has radon. We need to put a mitigation system. We need $1,000 to put that in order for us to move forward with the closing. And so a mineral buyer could come in if it's a significant issue, and if it's a probate issue, there's some, depending on the jurisdiction, I'm not totally sure in all states and jurisdictions who's responsible for what, but typically the owner has to hire an attorney to do that. So they're the one that has to do that work. Who pays for that is something you would have to negotiate with the buyer on. It could be a potential opportunity for you to split or share some of the costs if you couldn't afford to do it on your own. So that's sort of, probably a couple most common things that people might run into. And then when it comes down to preparing the closing documents, like the deed, I would totally expect the mineral buyer to pay for that and to have their attorney prepare that document. On the flip side, you probably should hire an attorney before you sign any legal document. So just to make sure that you understand what you're signing. If you don't, if you have a good feel, you've gone through a lot of real estate transactions, maybe that's not necessary. But in some cases, it may be money worth spending, because there could be things like money's in suspense. And so what you might run into is where you have an oil and gas company where they have producing well on the minerals. There's title issues, and so it's maybe still in this example I gave earlier, still in the name of your grandfather who's passed away. And so what they have done since then, when those checks started getting sent back and returned to sender, not address unknown kind of a thing, then you get that money held in suspense. So most states require that money to it's still in the ownership of the grandfather. So it's still his money, and so the oil and gas company can't just keep it. So they have to hold it in suspense over enough period of time. Some of that could be escheated to the state, which means that basically they've, over a certain time period has elapsed, that money has continued to accumulate. They couldn't find the rightful owner. They tell the state about it. The state has a database, and most states have it online where you can go and look and enter a name, and it'll tell you if there's any monies owed to them and what it is and how much it is and by whom. And so that's something that, if you look at the deed and the fine print, some of those will say that you're signing over all of that, even something you may not know that you actually have right to. And that's, as part of signing that deed, you're handing over the right to any of those monies, whether they're ever in the past or not. And so that's one of the things that you could end up, could cost you a lot of money, or leave a lot of money on the table if you aren't aware of that, and you don't spend a few $1,000s or maybe even a few $100s just to have an attorney quickly review a deed and say, yep, this is what it means, this is what you're signing. So that's something to consider there. That probably summarizes enough, I think, in terms of the different things, who would pay for what and what documents are out there for a typical transaction. So.
Yep, absolutely. No, I think that covers it well, man. And then for people that, they now kind of understand and they're looking through to see what might be something that would be interesting in selling, is there a rule of thumb that people can kind of follow to kind of have an idea of what the property would be worth?
There sometimes is, yeah. So if it's a producing property where it's been pretty well developed, so you have some existing horizontal wells, let's say, that have been drilled in the past 10 years. It's pretty much fully developed in the particular formation. You say, yeah, I think this is pretty pretty much it. You can look at a cash flow multiple. So if you look at your recent royalty checks and look at the average, say over the past 3 months or so, and then multiply it by, between 50 and 70, sometimes up to 100 in certain really hot areas. That'll tell you sort of a ballpark number of what value might be placed on those royalties. Again, that's really kind of only valid in the case where you're in a mature field. There's no expectation of future development. You have a really good understanding of the well decline, or maybe it's pretty flat. That can sometimes give you a ballpark. Sometimes it could be low end, and sometimes it can be high if it's if people are feeling it's on the tail end of any future potential. So that's something you can use just as a ballpark number to see if that is your situation and you get an offer, is it really just a really low ball offer, or is it in the range that I mentioned?
Absolutely. Well, no, and I think that ties in perfectly too. I'm a mineral rights owner. I now know some idea of the value of the mineral rights that I own. Should I sell? Is selling my only option? What options are open to me as a mineral right owner?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what I tell people is unless you need the money now, probably hold on to your minerals. I think the thing that you can, once you sell them, there's really no going back. So if you were to sell all 100% of all your right, title, and interest to any mineral rights you own, it's a done deal. There's no going back. So down the road, they may find out that there's this whole other, like the scenario I mentioned, other formation that's productive. You don't have the option of participating in that because you've sold your mineral rights. Now, that said, it really depends on someone's immediate and kind of long-term personal and financial goals. If you want to leave a long-term, legacy for your family, you have a significant mineral estate, but you maybe need cash now, you don't have to sell all of your minerals necessarily. There's different vehicles you can use to maintain control while selling a portion to get some immediate cash. And one of those is that non-participating royalty interest I mentioned. So that's the case where you could sell the royalty out of the mineral estate, keep the executive rights to be able to sign a lease and dictate terms of the lease. But then you can get some cash if you maybe have medical bills you need to pay, or if you have some credit card debt you'd like to pay off, stuff like that you say, yeah, this is really an opportunity for me to take advantage of this hot trend, and I need it now versus needing, maybe being willing to wait for 3, 4, or 5 years before a well might be drilled on your property if there's a lot of activity. Yeah, definitely that's a way to do it. Or you could sell just a portion. You can sell any portion, 1% to up to 100%, and anywhere in between, enough to cover your immediate cash need, but then keep the option value of any future wells being drilled and that upside potential. If you're willing to take a risk, I guess. So that's the other thing, talking about risk. So if you get a cash payment now, there's not a lot of risk with that. You're giving up the option value in exchange for that cash. The person that's buying those minerals from you is taking on the risk that wells may or may not be drilled. Assuming they're not the ones that are going to plan on drilling it and themselves and kind of be the master of their destiny, but you're kind of relying on other operators in the area to drill. So there's a risk with that, and that's a consideration too. And that's, there is the other flip side of that is, there's activity now. Well, price may drop down to $30 a barrel again for oil, and then all of a sudden there's not going to be any drilling in your area anywhere in the near term. And so if you had an expectation that in the next 3 to 5 years you start to see some royalty checks coming in, there's a risk that may not happen because it's not economic for an operator to drill a well in your area. So something to consider.
Absolutely. No. And I think, another important thing for mineral right owners too to understand is that when oil and gas companies or mineral rights companies are buying mineral rights, they see this as an investment. So there's got to be a way long term that they make their money back from the buy. And mineral rights owners have to understand that, when you're selling, you're doing just that. You're selling it to somebody who sees it as an investment and will need to recoup their investment over time.
Yeah, exactly. They're in the business of making money, right? So it's not a charitable transaction. Typically, like to your point, if they expect to make a 20% return, let's say on the investment, it's an area that's not, it's in exploration, so they're needing to get a little bit. They want to get a little bit higher rate of return because there's a higher risk associated with it, which is one way that minerals are valued. When they do the analysis, they'll look at that discount rate that they use, and they'll say, well, this is in a riskier area. There's a chance it may take a decade before a well's drilled here. We really need to get rate of return of around 20 or 30% in order for this to make sense financially because of that risk. On the flip side of that, maybe they're willing to pay a little bit more in an area that there's wells that are being drilled today, and it's imminent. The production is imminent. I want to sell now and to get top dollar. And in that case, maybe you could demand a little bit higher lump sum value. In other words, they would be willing to pay with a lower discount rate. So what that means is that interest rate they're using to discount the future cash flows back to today's dollar is at a smaller interest rate, which actually ends up meaning that it's worth more today because you're not discounting the future cash flows as much. You're not risking them as much. So that's something to think about. So it is, and it should be fair, on both sides, right? So they're in business to make money. There's not an efficient market for mineral rights, so they have the connections and the portfolio. Maybe they're willing to buy in different areas and spread out the risk. And so they're by having a diversified portfolio, kind of like your retirement portfolio. You don't hold it all in high risk, tech stocks. You may have some bonds in there. You have some small cap, some large cap stocks. So you spread that out because what you're doing is diversifying and spreading out the risk. So if maybe stocks are down, maybe bonds are up, and so you're sort of balancing out that. And so with many mineral buyers will buy in different areas and different basins to spread out the risk, so that if one area gets hung up with maybe some environmental laws that are going to be passed, or state ballot initiatives, which we'll talk about some of the news here at the end, if that's going to potentially affect the value of their minerals in that area, they maybe compensate for that by investing in other areas and spreading out the risk.
Absolutely. And again, that's perfect. It's perfect time to tie into the news. We had some news for mineral rights owners specifically for Colorado, but we thought it would be, we were talking before the show and thought it would be absolutely great to bring to everyone's attention, and we'll try to continue doing this in the future.
Yeah, I think this was a great time. This was a great suggestion by Justin here. And he and I are both news junkies as it relates to our minerals. We want to know what's going on with commodity prices and, what are the different initiatives and different things going on in the areas where we have minerals, just so we can keep on top of it, like any other investment. And so one of the things that came up in Colorado here recently was there's a ballot initiative that's right now gathering signatures. And when we're recording this is in June of 2018. So statewide ballot initiative 97, that they're trying to propose that any new wells that are drilled would need to be located at least 2,500 feet from any homes, schools, or water sources. And that expands. The current buffer right now is between 500 to 1,000 feet. And so that would, in some cases, be 5 times further away. And effectively what it would do, so you think about like Colorado right now, the big area is the Wattenberg Field, or you hear about the Denver-Julesburg Basin in northeast Colorado, so primarily in Weld County and Adams County, where there's a lot of drilling going on right now. That would eliminate any future oil and gas production in the Wattenberg Field. So if you happen to own mineral rights in Weld County, and you're expecting that to leave a lasting legacy for your family because you know that there's been a lot of activity going on, you're getting offers to buy your minerals or lease your minerals, that's going to have a significant impact potentially on the value of your mineral rights. And so it's something to keep tabs on if that does pass and go to the ballot. I assume it would be this fall. I'm not 100% sure, but something that you would want to probably talk to your neighbors about, and your other, neighbors that own minerals, and say, hey, did you know this is coming up? Let's get informed. Let's understand what the impact is, and make sure you vote, right? So that's a big one coming up that I came across here this week that is kind of rearing its ugly head again. I understand the justification from a environmental standpoint. There was the Firestone incident in Colorado where there was an explosion at a house from an oil flow line under a gas flow line under a house, and that had leaked and it exploded. And so I understand. I'm sensitive to that. I also own a house, and I would not want that to happen in my area, right? But there's a balance, right? So we have to think about that balance of protecting the environment and public safety with the rights that people that own property have to produce minerals. And so it's definitely a topic to keep tabs on. So that was
Absolutely.
one that I came up with. Justin, you have any others that you
No, I think that's
right now?
the time. West Texas, of course, is always heating back up for those people that own mineral rights out there. Like you were mentioning, some of the fields that they thought were years gone past, they've learned how to get back in there and recomplete them and get some activity going. But more so to the Colorado news story, we'd encourage mineral right owners to get out and participate in your community and make a difference. Along with the loss of the Legacy 4 people, this could potentially impact over 200,000 jobs in Colorado. So be an advocate, be a mineral right advocate, make your own decision, but get out and get involved with your community to be sure that these things you've worked so hard and your ancestors have worked so hard to make sure that you have stay in your possession. But no, I think that about wraps it up for the news.
Thanks again for your time, Justin, and we'll I think be talking here in the future, and we'll feature Justin in some of these future episodes for other fellow mineral owners. I think some of the things that you can expect to hear coming up on the docket, so to speak. We have discussion around leasing is another one of the topics coming up, and then if you do decide to sell. We'll talk in a little more detail about what to know about selling your mineral rights and what to consider. Another episode, I think, we'll look at some of those oil and gas title defects and what are the curative measures you might need to take. And we'll get some other guests on here in the future that are experts in these areas. We'll get some attorneys in here, I think, to potentially help us break down, what you need to worry about. So with that, we'll wrap up this episode. Stay tuned for more information for mineral owners, and continue to send us any suggestions you might have. You can do that at mineralrightspodcast.com. Go on there. We have a phone number you can call, or you can email me with any questions you have, and we'll try to feature those here in upcoming episodes. So thanks again, and thanks, Justin.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.